Hey everyone, welcome back to Amaranth Bay. Today we're going to build a couple of cool bridges that will provide access across the bay to what will eventually become a new town. We're going to start off by building this big freeway bridge. We'd already placed the actual highway portion of it back when we built the nearby interchange, but today we're going to be making it look a lot better and more realistic. I'm going to use this classic bridge asset that I'm sure any Todos Santos fans out there are going to remember quite well, but I didn't want this bridge to just be a copy of something that I've already done. So instead, I'm going to have it be a copy of something in real life. Never done that before, which is the Blatnik Bridge in Duluth. Hopefully that's how you say it. So this bridge was built in 1961, and I believe it's actually slated for replacement in the coming years, which is kind of interesting. But we're just going to be building something inspired by the current bridge. I did this build basically by mangling this poor asset with PO to get something that fits the context better. So these truss bits on either side are going to get lowered down so that they can rest on top of these pillars and hold up the bridge deck above them, which we're going to custom make those pillars and stuff in a second. And I also lowered the main span of the bridge down just a little bit to give it kind of a shorter look because the Blatnik bridge has a relatively low profile compared to this asset, so I wanted to make that adjustment quickly. The original asset is meant to be a double-decker bridge, so you have these two layers of beams at the bottom, which is kind of an issue because we just want a lame single-decker bridge. So I'm going to make some adjustments for that as well. Don't worry about the lack of rail running along the bottom of this not double-decker bridge because we are going to be bringing both trains and streetcars across the bay with a different bridge build later on. For now, I'm just going to merge all the nodes of the upper beams together, which essentially removes all those bits from view, and then we're just left with the lower beams that appear to be holding up the freeway, or at least hopefully they're holding up the freeway. For those pillars that I mentioned, I'm first just going to get rid of the ones that are built into the network using network skins, which is super handy for this kind of thing. And then I'm going to go ahead and PO these vanilla pillar props, which I actually quite like the look of. They have a nice texture to them, I think. I'm going to gently taper them, which I think makes for a more interesting and realistic silhouette to the bridge. If you look at these things in real life, they tend to have a bit of taper. The pillars are going to get some big foundation things that sit in the water. I don't know what these are called or how they're installed in the first place, but I think that they're important, kind of like with the pillars, to just round out the silhouette and give it a feeling that all this weight is actually distributed somewhere. So I think that just kind of adds to the realism when you just kind of glance at this thing. It just strikes you as being actually able to hold up all of this weight. So I guess that these sorts of pillars usually have these things called dolphins in front of them, which protect the pillars from ships accidentally running into the pillars and potentially collapsing the bridge. I have to say, if I had to put my money on a freighter that weighs tens of thousands of tons versus a tiny barrel in the water, I would probably put my money on the freighter, but I'm not a gambler, so we're just going to add them in for realism anyway. At this point, I realized that even with all the kind of structural changes to the bridge, it still looked pretty much exactly like the one that I built in Todos Santos. So I decided to change the color to look a bit more like the real-life bridge. Basically, I just added a color rectangle over the texture because it doesn't have any built-in color changing ability, and I gave it more of a metallic gray kind of look, which I think is nice. Even though it's more bland, I think it has kind of almost a more impressive look to it this way, at least in this context. So I also realized that I had forgotten to add in the normal freeway pillars at this point, not just the ones holding up the actual bridge structure. So I'm going to add those into the approach, custom making them with PO so that they look a little bit different from the main pillars. So I'm going to use a second copy to add a crossbar in the middle, just like the ones you see in Duluth, and I'm also going to give these a bit of taper as well. I had them spaced out way too far apart, as you can see here, so I did end up coming back off camera and doubling the number of pillars so that hopefully that looks a little bit more realistic. So far, this is just a bridge to absolutely nowhere. There's nothing over here other than this kind of grid of country lanes that I added in off camera quite a while ago, and a whole lot of woods, which will soon be pared back in order to allow for some development. But before any of that, and before moving on to the next bridge build, I wanted to do a quick rail and freeway expansion so that we can get some traffic moving across the bay and see how this bridge looks with some cars on top of it. So in real life, the freeway kind of swoops over this channel here and goes across one of these piers and then ends at an interchange that is right on the edge of the town of Superior. So that might have been the best option back in 1961, but I wanted to route our freeway a bit differently. To do that, we're going to shift the rail over here so we can have a freeway right on the shoreline after the gentle approach from the bridge. Is there another word for approach if you're leaving the bridge? I feel like there should be a different word for that. And it might not actually sound like an upgrade to cut off the shoreline here versus the way they do it in real life. And maybe it isn't actually an upgrade, I don't know. But just keep in mind that all of this coastal land here is either currently or was historically used for industry. So I think it seems like a more or less reasonable choice here if we have to run a freeway that is heading south down into Wisconsin, or whatever our version of Wisconsin is called, that they could run it along the freeway here in order to bypass the town. So I don't feel too bad about this location. To create the route of the highway itself as it travels south here, I tried a bit of a different technique than I usually do. So I just copied a length of the couplet and then pasted it along at various spots along the shore, just rotating it enough to be parallel with each stretch of shoreline. And then I used Network Multi-Tool to connect up the different segments, so you get these nice gentle curves. And I think it's just a pretty easy way to get the very gradual kind of swooping character that you see in big interstates like this, especially in flat areas like we're working in. So over at the edge of the map, I connected up the freeway to make a new outside connection that should get some traffic flowing. I did actually accidentally have a stretch of the incoming freeway pointed the wrong way, so that blocked traffic from heading over the bridge in that direction for a while, but I did come back and fix that eventually. I also connected the freeway here up to this little fake town that I have at the edge of the map, which I just like to use to generate some traffic and control rail lines, and of course the ferry line here as well. But I think I've mentioned that before on the series, so I'm not going to go into too much detail showing off that at the moment. So with all the traffic flowing nicely and the highway bridge all done, it's time to address this ugly rail line, which obviously would block any ship traffic from going underneath the bridge, kind of defeating the purpose of building this tall bridge in the first place. So back in the day in Duluth, there used to be a couple of swing bridges that crossed this channel. One of them was the Interstate Bridge. Now all that's left of it is this arch span, which is, I believe, used as a fishing pier. Now that's a pretty cool use of old infrastructure if you're going to tear down this old bridge anyway, but I wanted to build a swing bridge. So we're going to bring the old Interstate Bridge back to life. Kind of. So for the approach segments, I used these cool tracks from the Railway 2 pack. I don't know exactly what they're called, but they have this nice weathered look and this kind of metal siding alongside it. So it just looks nice and old, like it could fit into this kind of historic bridge. Of course, I removed the built-in pillars, just like with the highway, because they're not going to really line up properly with the way that we're going to build this thing, because it's going to be a little bit weird. I believe there was a point where the Interstate Bridge had streetcar and possibly road traffic traveling across it, along with the standard rail traffic, of course. And I think that the streetcar either shared tracks with the main rail line or it had lines on either side of the main track. I'm not sure which one it was, but I really couldn't think of a way to make that work with the situation that we have here without having it look and function just terribly. So I decided to just have a two-way streetcar track to one side, and we're just going to forgo the road traffic entirely because we now have this massive freeway bridge looming above it. Anyway, I crammed this streetcar track as close as possible to the track just to make the bridge width as small as possible, and then I connected it up to the main avenue and the streetcar line up above on this kind of weird little ramp. Because there isn't going to be any road traffic turning here, I made a small pavement peninsula to fill in the empty gap in the intersection, which I just think looks a bit more realistic than having this unnecessary gap in the median, which just looks very Cities Skylines-like, I think. Not that there's anything wrong with looking like Cities Skylines, but I just want it to look a little bit different than usual. Heading back to work on the bridge itself, I'm going to copy these foundations from the Freeway bridge and position them on either end of where the swing bridge span is going to go in the middle. So these are going to eventually hold up either end of the approach arch spans of the bridge. The central swing span, on the other hand, is going to require a little bit of a different approach. So my plan here was to build a semi-functional swing bridge, kind of like what we did back in episode 1 with the semi-functional lift bridge. First, I found some invisible versions of both train track and streetcar track on the workshop, which some people had very nicely made and uploaded for public use. Then I built the structure of the bridge span itself, and the closest thing I could find were these bridge pieces that are meant to be part of a massive bridge asset that you like plop down and it spawns in all these different pieces. But I'm just going to use these two pieces to get this nice, like, pointy looking style of bridge span that you would see on the interstate bridge. I'm not sure if there's a name for this kind of structure, so we'll just call it the pointy bit. So I grouped those together with PO and then used the distort function so that I could adjust the size and shape of both of them at the same time, which is really handy. So you can kind of make sure everything's centered and lined up properly. So at this point, I realized that the bridge piece had a bit of a taper at the bottom, which I'm sure looks really nice when it's integrated into the whole asset that you're using properly. But I don't really like to use assets properly, so I'm going to go ahead and flatten out the bottom taper so that everything is nice and level. Other than that, the only adjustments I needed to make was to change the color to give it this nice rusty look that you see on the remnant in Duluth. I did like the green of the original asset, but I thought that this darker color would contrast better with the light color of the Freeway bridge, just kind of emphasizing the difference in age here. It's a little bit weird, but I've seen pictures of the interstate bridge where some of these pictures show an arch span on both sides of the swing span, and some only show it on the Duluth side. So the pictures with only one span seem to be taken later. So I guess at some point the one on the superior side was dismantled for some reason. But no matter what the cause of that was, we will of course be taking the option with more bridges, and we're going to build an arch span on either side. And this is going to allow shorter boat traffic to pass under the bridge, even when the swing span is not open. For the arch, I used this asset, which I think is actually the same one I used for the top of the lift bridge, again, back in episode 1. And I'm basically going through the same process as the pointy central span to get it to the right size and shape and color. Underneath the swing section, we get this little island thingy where the spinny bit goes. I think that's what those are called. To keep everything cohesive, I just used the same foundation piece as go underneath the pillars and stretched it out to match the length of the swing span, so that when it's rotated out, it won't just be sticking out into the water, which presumably is not good from an engineering point of view. I don't know. So for the spinny piece, the only asset that I had that really had kind of a substantial cylindrical look was this concrete silo. So I used one of those for kind of the outer casing, and then I used a second copy of this to represent the part that actually spins around and physically moves the bridge. For the rest of the island, I just added in a couple of details that I could make out from some of these old grainy photographs. So there's a little building that is down there, which I assume is used by like operators or whatever to manage the swinging of the swing bridge. And there's also like a small shed or access building or something like that over on the other side. I also saw in some of these pictures that there are these kind of pointy metal structures on the extreme ends of the island. So I took another random bridge piece and color matched it to the rest of the thing and shrunk it way down and placed it on either end. I don't know if these are meant to be like part of the mechanism that swings the bridge or if they're just there to hold the weight of the bridge when it's open. But I do think it kind of helps to flesh out the look of the bridge overall. Finally, to finish that off, I just added a short barrier around the edges using this barrier network, which I think adds some definition to the island and makes it just stand out a little bit more. So just in case all of this seemed a little bit too easy so far, that's because it has been. Like I said before, my plan was to have this thing have the ability to actually rotate and open on command. So to even attempt that, I figured that I had to make the whole thing out of POs. So because of that limitation, I wanted to keep things pretty simple in terms of how many assets I was using and how easy it was to put together. So I made the base out of just this ploppable asphalt, and then made the tracks out of these steel beam pieces, which I lined up with the tracks and stretched them out to cover the whole length of the span. thought it looked a little bare, so I also added in these pavement pieces between the rail and the streetcar tracks, and then also one to serve as the pedestrian deck too. They're not really meant to be pavement. I assume they would be metal or some other relatively lightweight material, but I just thought it needed something with a slightly different color. And finally, to keep the pedestrians that are crossing here from tumbling to their deaths in the bay, I added in a railing as well, which was quite fun to do. So with all the individual pieces set up, I grouped them all together in PO, with the plan being to animate the central pillar and then have the rest of the group follow that rotation. So I found this PO motion module on the workshop, which allows you to do all kinds of cool keyframed animations, which is very nice. And I set up an animation to have this thing rotate around. So you can click this button here to set it so that all the child assets in the group follow the animation. So here I have the spinny bit as the parent or whatever it's called, and then all the other ones are its child, which is a little bit creepy when you think about it. But so here's the final result. Yeah, it looks really good. So the problem here, it seems like when each child asset is set to rotate alongside the parent asset, each one rotates around its own central axis instead of the central axis of the entire group. I tried doing every combination of settings I could think of. I tried using other like rotation modules, and I just couldn't get everything to align together and rotate together properly. So after a lot of off-camera experimentation, I just ended up writing this one off as a semi-failure, unfortunately. But the good thing about that is that since it's a semi-failure, that also means it's a semi-success. So it's a success in the sense that I can still manually rotate the whole thing using Move It, so we can at least get some cool cinematic shots of ships passing through the open bridge, and we just won't be able to capture the actual motion itself. So despite all those issues with the swing bridge, I'm still really happy with how both of these bridges look. I think that they're probably two of my favorite builds that I've done in a long time, just from as far as they look. So as tempted as I am to just leave it at that and call it a success, we have a lot more land to fill in before we can have this area be nice and satisfactorily completed. So first off, we're going to build that ferry terminal that I mentioned. Because there aren't any ferry terminals in Duluth, at least as far as I know, we're going to once again look to a different city for inspiration. So they have a ferry that crosses Lake Michigan over to some town in the state of Michigan. I don't know where our version of the ferry is headed, but that doesn't really matter because I mostly just want this to look cool. So I used this big avenue to create the queue area at the end of the terminus of the streetcar line here. I just shifted it over with node controller a little bit so that the left edge here is lined up more with the edge of the streetcar street. And I think that just looks more realistic than having it centered. So it kind of makes sense here that the outgoing traffic is going to kind of line up on one side, and then you have this big piece hanging out here where all the incoming traffic will line up in the area here. Of course, we'll be detailing that up later, so I'm just going to cover up all these markings with some ploppable asphalt. Before doing any detailing though, I wanted to get the ferries running properly so that we can have everything lined up with the docked boats. I found this invisible ferry stop on the workshop, which actually works perfectly, which is really nice because sometimes these ferry buildings and stuff can be a little bit finicky. The turn here for the ferries coming in ended up being a little bit tight due to the proximity to the bridge. So even though in real life, I feel like the ferries would just kind of sidle in rather than doing a full 180-degree turn, I probably could have avoided this issue if I had just placed the pier on the side closer to the dock so that they can kind of just slide in. But that would have made the on-land portion of the build quite a bit harder to do because of this steep embankment we have here that the main avenue is on. Anyway, I connected the ferry path up to the main line that runs through the bay. So I waited for one of these ferries to get lined up with the spot here, and then I got to detailing. For the car access, there's this little pier that sticks off of the main dock. At this point, I'm just going to make the lanes for the cars, and the actual physical structure of the pier will follow in just a minute. First, I used these pavement roads that come with these nice lumps of land attached to them. Although later on I did figure out that I could actually just use invisible roads here to get rid of that and not have to deal with all the ugly terrain and stuff. So I came back and adjusted that off camera. I originally planned to have a ferry prop attached to the pier, like have the boat itself be a prop. And I was just going to try to get cars to drive into it with a little bit of network trickery and have them like drive down into the crust of the earth and then pop up at the edge of the map or something, so that I would kind of use it as an outside connection almost. But I couldn't actually find a car ferry prop on the workshop, only these vehicles. So what we're going to do is have the cars that are queuing up just be static, and then the movement of the ferries will hopefully add that dynamic element that I want to get out of this. Back to detailing, it looked a little bit silly to have this entrance ramp floating over the water. It doesn't seem very realistic. So I added in some supports, kind of like the ones you see in Milwaukee, which also come with these attached barriers. For the queuing area, I just use IMT to create some thick dashed lines, just like the ones you see in real life. And with those placed, I just messed around with the spacing a little bit here so that it doesn't look like you'd have to turn too sharply to get in or out of the boarding lanes from the queuing lanes. Of course, these lanes are also going to be numbered so that you would stop at the booth, get your ticket, and then they would direct you into whatever lane they wanted you to go into. So off camera, I ended up adding in some car props parked here, and also a couple of dynamic, individual, invisible parking spots that we can have a little bit of variation in terms of the number of cars that are lined up here. Of course, in addition to cars and foot traffic, we also have this main streetcar line here. This is the terminus of the main line that passes through downtown. So presumably they would expect a good amount of foot traffic here. So that combined with the whatever pedestrians were brave enough to walk through the industrial zone and get here on foot, I imagine they would expect quite a good amount of foot traffic. So for that, I basically did the exact same thing as the car on-ramp, but I just scaled everything down to about hip width for the gangway. So for anyone who did not want to drive onto the ferry, walk to the ferry, or take our free and convenient streetcar system to the ferry, why wouldn't you do one of those? We're going to add in a giant parking lot, which I somehow managed to make so horribly that I crashed the entire game. So I hadn't actually saved at this point. I had saved after building the bridges, but not after starting this. So that was fun. But I got over it pretty quickly, and then I just recreated the entire thing. It's good use of a Saturday afternoon. So with all that progress restored, it's really just a matter of building the building itself and trying again with the parking lot, hopefully without destroying the game in the process. I took a little workshop shopping trip, and I didn't see any assets that really I thought would work for this purpose. So I just went with this building from London, I believe, that I think just looks kind of fitting here. Obviously, I didn't want a big tower or anything like that, so I just used the top few floors, turning it into a PO to sink it down into the ground easily. And we'll add some doors and other stuff to make it look like an actual building when we get to detailing. And that detailing phase is going to begin now. So the ferry terminal itself is done, but we do have these shoulders of land on either side, which we're just going to detail up very quickly. I don't know if you guys really enjoy watching these kinds of areas get filled in. I know that I feel like they can sometimes make the video feel a little repetitive or drag on a little bit, but I thought that showing these random corners of the city getting detailed kind of just help give the development of the city a bit more character that might be missing if I just show the big builds and leave out all these little things. So let me know if you're interested in seeing these little random bits of land get filled in with uninteresting things. As for what those uninteresting things are, they're very straightforward. So we have an empty lot on this side attached to the port, which would basically just be kind of an informal side entrance that would probably not be used as much as the other ones just because it's not as convenient. And then on the other side of the ferry terminal, there's just a little nubbin of nature. Nature nubbin. A natural nubbin. All right, we're almost done, and now all that's left is this area between the freeway approach. Looking back to Duluth for inspiration this time, we have a public water access spot in the equivalent location, so I'm going to just very quickly build something like that to finish off the video. First off, I connected the wastewater treatment plant entrance that we made last episode to the main road system so that we could build the water access parking lot off of this road and just allow access to this entire area. At the terminus of the perpendicular road here, we have the boat launch, which kind of like the one in Duluth will have a small pier in the middle. So you could launch lighter boats and kayaks or that kind of thing off of here. And then on either side, there's a ramp just in case you wanted to back in a trailer into the water with a bigger boat on it. Alongside that, I placed another invisible ferry depot so that we could have some recreational boats coming and going from the launch. At this point, the only ferry vehicle I had that really fit the bill was this sailboat. As you can see, that causes some issues with the bridge here. So I will go onto the workshop and find like some motorboats or kayaks or something like that and replace the sailboats with those so that they can just cruise on right underneath the arch bridge without this happening. Beyond that, there's just a couple of details to plop down, and those are foliage. So we have some grass and trees along the shore, trying to be nice and judicious with the number of trees that I put down here. Let's see how that works out. And in the main part of the lot, we of course have some trailer parking for people who have already launched their boats or are, I guess, waiting to access the boat launch. So instead of using decals, I used IMT for this, which is really nice because you can actually change the width of the decal really easily. And it's just a lot easier than doing it in PO and trying to space them out manually. So that comes in handy here. Actually, IMT always comes in handy. So I probably didn't even need to say that. There was this little open area beneath the bridge, which I thought about building something in. In Duluth, there's like I think like a UPS facility here or something. But I thought that our space here was a little bit cramped, so I decided just to make it into one of these open, grassy areas that you see in the industrial zone in Duluth. I tried to get some nice texture here by having a mixture of this kind of more fluffy looking mountain grass combined with patches of these shrub props, which I've used all over the city. And then, of course, I sprinkled in a couple of trees and bushes as well, for luck. And with that, we are done with this build and the entirety of the industrial zone. I know that not everyone exactly enjoys these industrial builds, so not that this is a particularly industrial build, but it's in the industrial zone, so I think, same thing basically, as far as marketing is concerned. So if you did stick through the entire run of industrial build episodes, I really appreciate it. And I hope that you enjoyed them. We'll definitely be doing more cool industrial builds in the future, kind of in some of the outlying areas. But for the time being, we're going to move on to a totally different area. I'll let you figure out where that one's going to be. Definitely not related to today's build at all. Nope. I wanted to say thank you to my channel members with an extra special shout out to my $5 tier members, New and Victor Selwyn. Thank you very much. And thank you for watching. See ya. A natural nubbin of nature. Nature's nubbin, the nature of nubbins.